Greetings, sisters and brothers, comrades, friends. Welcome to African History Club, episode number 36. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. I welcome a couple of new patrons that joined in the past week. So today, I'm going to take a detour. I had started discussing my book in the last episode. My book, Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media. I hope most of you have had a chance to order the book through the publisher, Kendall Hunt Publishing. I posted the information. In case you're still having any difficulty getting a copy of the book, please let me know, send me a message. I'm also going to be doing a reading, an online reading and Q&A. It's going to be hosted by a DC-based organization, Institute of Polity Services, and I'm going to post that information as well at the end of this episode. So today I want to take a detour. I wanted to continue discussing other chapters from the book. But as I indicated, if there's a topical issue that intervenes in the meantime, then I will switch and discuss that issue. And there is such an issue. And it's related to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, lending $1 billion, approving the loan on June the 28th to the military dictatorship in Uganda under General Yoweri Museveni. And I want to discuss this in a broader context. I want to show how two institutions, the IMF and the sister organization, the World Bank, have become the most effective durable instruments for maintaining neocolonialism in Africa. As most of you know, the IMF and the World Bank are controlled essentially by the United States as the largest shareholders in both of these organizations. The IMF and the World Bank have now replaced the need for the outdated gunboat diplomacy in terms of needing to deploy troops to intervene in a periphery country. Of course, occasionally there's still need to have this kind of military intervention. We saw in the case of Africa most recently with the intervention in Libya by the United States and its NATO partners to destroy Muammar Gaddafi's government, to replace it with what they had hoped would be a pliant entity or state. And obviously things did not go exactly as they had hoped. And Libya has now been destroyed and essentially sent back into the Stone Ages. They'd hoped to be able to benefit from Libyan oil, because Libya was unique in that, unlike countries like Saudi Arabia, where the oil essentially is controlled by the major oil companies, in Libya, the national oil company was in charge. So Gaddafi was really setting the terms. And that's how he was able to capture much of the surplus and really economically develop Libya and give a very high standard of living to the citizens of Libya. Of course, the West did not like this, and that was the main motivating factor for wanting to depose Muammar Gaddafi. And of course, they always have that nonsense about wanting to save Libyans from Gaddafi's tyranny, to save Libyan lives. And of course, that argument was exploded by the conduct of the war itself, with the massive bombings 24/7 for almost a year. How are you going to be saving Libyan lives? By bombing and killing many, many more times Libyans than were ever killed during the Gaddafi government, which lasted for a very long time in Libya. So that was essentially nonsense. But yes, on those rare occasions, they do still intervene militarily. But in most cases now, the World Bank and the IMF and the financial pressure and control that they're able to exert on African countries have become the main weapons of choice. So let's focus a little bit about this particular instance in Uganda, the $1 billion loan. It was purportedly, the official reason is to shore up the economy, which has retrenched as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is true. But here's the much more critical part. Last year, the same IMF loaned the military dictatorship in Uganda $491 million. The IMF's sister tool of imperialism, which is the World Bank, also loaned $300 million to the military regime. And as us who follow Uganda closely and other African countries, we complain. And we said this money is not going to be used for the intended purpose, which was to fight the pandemic and to provide direct assistance to Ugandans who are unable to work during the shutdown last year. It does not take rocket science to have made this prediction, because we've been following the military regime in Uganda for a long time. And it's proven to be very reliable in terms of its corruption activities. The money from the IMF was diverted and some embezzled. The money from the World Bank was also embezzled and diverted to a classified account. And the only entities that had access to this account was the office of the dictator himself, General Yoweri Museveni, and the armed forces and the police. So this money essentially was used to suppress the opposition parties and opposition leaders in the run-up to elections in Uganda, which occurred on January the 14th this year. Elections that were massively rigged by General Museveni. But the violence that preceded the election was, even by Ugandan standards, outrageous. On November 18 and 19, more than 100 people were massacred by the armed forces. And these are people that are come up to protest after the leading opposition candidate, the challenger, a member of parliament whose name is Robert Kyagulanyi, had been arrested. He's much more popularly known as Bobby Wine. And that killing essentially was financed by the loan from the World Bank and the IMF, because it's using those resources that the military regime was able to deploy soldiers massively in the months leading to the election, on the day of the election itself, and since the day of the election. The troop deployment has continued. And what is ongoing now in Uganda is a campaign of kidnapping, torture, and killings. Young people randomly picked from the streets or arrested from their homes in front of their family, their parents, particularly young men, because the youth are primarily the people that supported the candidacy of Bobi Wine, who is actually the presumptive winner of the elections. The elections were so rigged that even the United States Secretary of State issued a statement on April 16, saying the elections were neither free nor fair. In essence, meaning they don't recognize General Museveni as the legitimate president of Uganda. The European Union also voted unanimously to impose what is called global Magnitsky sanctions on the key political and military figures in Uganda involved in the violence and involved in the election rigging. So you would hope that the World Bank would take all these into consideration in determining whether to approve the $1 billion loan or not. So in essence, there are no legitimate, rational reasons that are used to approve this loan, except for the fact that General Museveni is a reliable agent of Western imperialism. Because of the money being diverted or embezzled last year out of the $491 million IMF loan and the $300 million World Bank loan, none of the programs to fight the pandemic could be effectively implemented. And now we are getting stories from Uganda in the newspapers that in many instances, people were being administered fake vaccines. In other words, vials that contained nothing but water. This is outrageous. And the World Bank and IMF are aware of all this corruption in Uganda, and yet still approve these loans. That is the best confirmation that it does not matter how brutal, how corrupt, and how incompetent a government is in order to determine whether they get the loan or not. Just has to be a reliable agent. And now let me give you some broader context by looking back into history so we can really analyze how dangerous and how reactionary the World Bank and the IMF are in terms of African liberation and self-determination. In an earlier episode, I looked at the World Bank's conduct in Ghana in the 1960s, when Kwame Nkrumah, the Pan-Africanist, the visionary who wanted to unite all of Africa into a United States of Africa so Africans could withstand Western imperialism and exploitation, the World Bank was used to undermine his government, to weaken his government, to make it unpopular, and to ultimately encourage the military and the police to overthrow Kwame Nkrumah, which is exactly what happened. In an earlier episode, I discussed correspondence, documents unearthed from the State Department's records, which in very explicit language indicated that the US should intervene and have the World Bank slow down or suspend disbursement of funds that had already been approved for Ghana to help build the Volta River project and the dam at Akosombo, which Nkrumah wanted to use to provide electric energy for Ghanaians and for Ghana's factories in order to industrialize, in order to use the domestic raw materials and manufacture in Ghana without having to export it as primary products, and in which case the surplus accrues to the Western countries, industrialized countries that use these materials to manufacture and then sell the products back to the periphery at massively inflated prices. So Nkrumah wanted to break that dependency cycle relationship. And he needed resources, he needed capital. And his only option was the World Bank. And even on that occasion, once Nkrumah was trapped into accepting that loan, and of course, in Nkrumah's case, he saw that the ultimate outcome, the end result, would justify the means. And that is why he entered into that agreement. But even in that case, once approved and once funding had started, because the United States did not like Nkrumah's politics in terms of wanting to be non-aligned, in terms of wanting to have good relations with China and the Soviet Union as well, it became policy to remove his government. So the World Bank loan was used as an instrument when the disbursement slowed down. Ultimately, Nkrumah did become unpopular as the economy struggled, and as planned by the United States, by Britain, and by France. These were the three primary countries that wanted to get rid of Nkrumah. Nkrumah was overthrown in 1966. Fortunately, the dam, the electric project, was completed just before he was overthrown, actually. So that was one successful legacy that he was able to leave for Ghana. Now let's look at another end where IMF resources is used in much a similar manner as it's being used today in Uganda to prop a Western-friendly puppet/dictatorship. And that was in the case of Mobutu in the Congo, a country that he had renamed Zaire during his long tyranny from 1960 to 1996-97, when he was ultimately overthrown. Mobutu, of course, was the soldier, the officer who overthrew Patrice Lumumba, a mentee of Kwame Nkrumah, also a visionary Pan-African and a nationalist. Was Prime Minister of the Congo from its independence, June 30, until September, when he was overthrown in 1960. And Mobutu handed him over to political rivals, Moise Tshombe, another Western puppet, who ultimately, together with Belgian agents, with the involvement of the CIA also, had him brutally murdered. Mobutu administered one of the most corrupt regimes anywhere in the world, embezzled an estimated $5 billion from the national treasury as well as from the so-called foreign aid. But now let's examine his relationship with the IMF. And there's a book that discusses this particular incident. And the book is called Dead Aid by Dambisa Moyo. D-A-M-B-I-S-A, Moyo, M-O-Y-O. She's a Zambian economist. Now, I have to make it clear that I don't agree much politically with Moyo. She tends to have this outlook that, with certain types of reforms in African countries, things could be corrected and economic trajectory of growth could then occur in African countries. That is very superficial. That is to suggest that neoliberalism can be corrected and made more beneficial to African countries. That is completely unrealistic. In order for Africa to take control of its development, political and economy, it has to actually exercise control over its resources. As many economists have argued, Samir Amin, Walter Rodney, whose work we've discussed on several episodes, and of course Kwame Nkrumah himself in Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Take control of resources, use raw materials to capture the surplus by using it for manufacturing production in Africa, and unite regionally and then continentally to create large-scale markets, which then benefit from economies of scale, and then divide in terms of which region produces certain products and certain industries so that they don't unnecessarily duplicate and squander resources. That is the path, really, to self-determination and economic growth for African countries, not superficial reforms. But having said that, I want to say I agree totally with Moyo's critique of the roles of the World Bank and the IMF and of foreign aid generally to African countries. So in this particular instance, she points out that on one occasion, the IMF sent a senior official to Congo, which was at that time Zaire, under Mobutu. And that official analyzed the records, the finances, and informed headquarters at the World Bank that the massive loans given to Mobutu were never going to be paid, the corruption was rampant, and embezzling of funds rampant, and recommended that no further loans be extended to the dictatorship. So what did the IMF do? In its great wisdom, it extended what at that time was the single largest loan infusion to General Mobutu's regime. And that was $700 million after this report of corruption and embezzlement by the senior IMF official back to his bosses at headquarters. So now you see there's no correlation in terms of these banks do not act as a bank, no issue of fiduciary obligations to shareholders, no. And yet this is footed primarily by United States taxpayers with their hard-earned money. Obviously, in this country, as we know, many people don't really know many of the activities that the United States government is involved in. Obviously, I'm not referring to us, I'm not preaching to the choir. I'm not preaching to people that come to a podcast like this, people that are relatively well informed and support the struggle for self-determination in the periphery regions of the world. I'm talking about the vast majority of Americans who are completely clueless that their tax dollars used to finance this type of tyranny that we had in Zaire and the one that we have in Uganda right now. Let me give you just one other example, which is so blatant and which proves beyond any doubt that Uganda has a crook as the military dictator. And I've discussed this episode in a previous podcast as well. In December 2018, a Chinese national named Patrick Ho was convicted in federal court here in the United States, in New York, a trial that I actually covered as well, of bribing General Museveni $1 million to split between him and his Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sam Kutesa. That does not sound like a lot of money when you talk about how much money these military dictators steal. And yes, it's not a lot of money in their terms, but that was a down payment to open the way for more bribes and for joint business deals between a Chinese energy company called CEFC China and Museveni's government, as well as his personal family business and the personal family business of his Foreign Minister, Sam Kutesa. Now, why was the trial in the United States? Because Patrick Ho had used a bank based in the United States to wire $500,000 to Minister Kutesa's account in Uganda. Museveni's own share was not wired. Get this. His share was delivered, mafia style, in cash, in a Gulfstream jet. When Patrick Ho flew from China, together with other business partners, and went to Uganda in 2016 as a guest of Museveni during his inauguration in 2016 in May, after he had stolen that election as well. And that is why Patrick Ho was convicted and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. And that information is available on the website of the U.S. Department of Justice. And it was widely covered, including by the Financial Times and business publications. So there's no question that the leadership at the World Bank and the IMF are aware of this. And yet, even that did not factor into making the decision to lend $1 billion to this dictatorship, which has now been in power for 35 years with United States support. Now, I pointed out earlier regarding the rigged election and how the Biden State Department had issued that statement saying the elections were neither free nor fair, meaning in essence that it does not recognize Museveni as the legitimate ruler of Uganda. And yet the United States made no effort to stop that loan from being approved. That loan could not be approved unless the United States was okay with that loan. So on the one hand, Biden can say democracy, human rights are the anchors of its foreign policy. On the other hand, have the IMF continue implementing the neo-colonial agenda in an African country, and in this case, Uganda. So I will stop at that point, and hopefully in the next episode we can go back to discussing manufacturing hate, how Africa was demonized in Western media, because that also plays a very essential role in maintaining neo-colonialism, in projecting and presenting Africans as a collection of tribal entities, depicting them as people that are not serious, people that are not worthy of self-determination. And I'll discuss that when we get back to discussing the book in the next episode of this podcast. So thank you, sisters and brothers, comrades and friends. Stay strong, be healthy and safe, and remain Pan-African. Thank you so much.